Hey guys, so today's video is, at that point in your family's evolution where you got to decide where you want to raise your kids. Usually it's when the kids are just prior to preschool age or preschool age, maybe 2 or 3 or so. And you get the sense that, wherever they start, like kindergarten, there's a real good chance you're going to be there for the duration. And so I'll talk a little bit about the decision-making process that my wife and I went to, sort of where we landed, and I'll give you the ending right now, which is we picked being way out in the country, which you can see from the environment here, and then sort of like what the upsides and downsides are of living out in the boonies, and one of the downsides, or probably the biggest downside, one that might actually surprise you. But anyway, we'll get to that in a little bit. First, just a word or two about the format of today's video, which you'll note is different from the normal one, where I'm kind of sitting in the family room next to the fire, very, very staged. And the reason why I'm doing this, I'm out walking my dog Teddy. Hold on, here's my guy. I'm doing this just to record a video in a much more relaxed environment. And the reason is, I started this channel a few weeks ago, and the purpose is so I could just share, my many decades of experience living life on this earth, things like some spirituality, relationships, just navigating the workplace, corporate America, and, making decisions about sort of your career, profession, just generally like life hacks, things that, as I said, I've learned along the way. And when I watch the videos that I've recorded online, I'm generally content with the content. I'll tell you, I do prepare. I think about what I'm going to say. I research certain topics. I practice. So I've been satisfied with generally what the videos are about, the content. But I got to say, I think the delivery has a little something to be improved. And what I mean by that is, when I watch the videos, sometimes I feel like I'm watching somebody else and not me. Or I'm watching like my work self, a little more serious, kind of uptight, intense. Sometimes I feel like I even look a little angry. And I thought, all right, I gotta try something different. So anyway, the reason why I'm doing this is walking Teddy and recording this video is just to maybe lighten the mood a little bit, see if I can, break down some of the barriers between you and my loyal viewing audience of 8 subscribers that I hope after this video maybe will be 9, which would make me, very happy. 10 I'd be ecstatic. So, please do hit the subscribe button. Anyway, so back to the topic of the day. As I said, my wife and myself, just like most families, when the kids were like maybe 2 years old, we had to decide whether we were going to stay in the house we were in or move. We knew that whatever that decision would be would probably set the course for their childhood, which is a huge, important decision, right? Where you live just affects the kind of life they have as a kid. In the house we lived in, it was a great house. It was in Arlington, which is a city just on the outskirts of Boston. Had a lot for families. It was, pretty gorgeous, neighborhoods and all that. But definitely had definitely had a little urban environment feel. It wasn't a true suburb by any means. Pretty compact, but it had a lot to offer. And the biggest advantage was it was really close to Boston. So we knew that if we raised our kids there, they would have complete access to Boston, everything that offers. But it's not what we wanted. It's not what I envisioned. For when I raised a family, I wanted a lot of yard, a lot of space. I wanted to be on the country. I really did, and my wife did too. So we looked around. We settled on the town we live in now. It's Harvard, Mass. It's small town, covers a lot of land area. The houses are pretty far apart, about an hour outside of Boston. And for us, it was the right move. We moved when the kids were I think maybe 2.5. So they started, preschool in this area, and so far so good. So now, as far as I'm going to go through sort of what I think are the best upsides of living in this town, and then I'll talk a little bit about the downsides. So, first the upsides. The first one is obvious. We're surrounded by beautiful nature, wildlife everywhere. Even when I walk this path, sometimes I see, tortoises on the side of the road. I've actually seen a moose coming up the road. We see bears, coyotes, owls. It's really nice. There are times when I look out in my backyard. I think one time I counted 13 deer. So you're definitely surrounded by wildlife. And also, there's just plenty of room for your kids to play. You just feel like there's just massive amount of space, and it's a general relaxed feeling in the environment you raise your kids in. And it's very pleasant. It's just, I don't know, you're just kind of in a good mood because you're not surrounded by a lot of noise and people and traffic. Those are a huge upside. The other one is, you live out in the country, you're probably going to live in a relatively small town. So you get very close to your friends, and this is true of everywhere. Your friends become your kids' friends' parents. But when the group is small, they almost become like your family. The kids, from the time they're in kindergarten, at least in our town, through high school, it's the same class. There's only one elementary school, one middle school, and one high school. So it's the same kids. So they're really almost like brothers and sisters. And also, my actual sister lives in Maryland. My brother's in New York State. So, they live far away. So having really close friends, in town is really important to my wife and me. Our families aren't nearby. So on holidays, we spend, Thanksgiving, Easter with our really close friends. So, it's very nice. And to the point where, from a very early age, we really just trust these friends of ours with our kids. We never worried about dropping them off and leaving them. In fact, as the years went on, our kids would even, go on vacation with their friends' parents and never worried about them. That's just a huge sort of upside. Another real upside to living in kind of out in the country, small town is, the school, as I said, is small. And one thing I just didn't even think about, but was pleasantly surprised, was the fact that, because there are, I think maybe 70 or 80 kids in the class, every kid, regardless of their athletic ability, they get to play every sport at the school level, even in high school, like at the varsity level in high school. Maybe with the one exception of basketball. I think, there were cuts, but kids didn't get cut from sports. So the activities, were available to everybody, regardless of the skill level. And that was pretty huge. And then last, I think, every town, every city has sort of, citywide, townwide activities, like here. But the nice thing in a small town is, when you go to them, everybody. Like here they have, in the summer, a farmer's market at the kids' elementary school. In the fall, they have this huge flea market with an apple festival where they, sell apple pie and apples and everything else. 4th of July, they have a nice little parade through the center of town. And, everybody along the side of the road, the kids in the parade. Halloween's the best. It's not just the kids trick or treat. I mean, the houses are kind of far apart here. You couldn't really do it. So, you take your candy to the fire station and they distribute the candy to the houses in the center of town. And all the kids go to the center of town and trick or treat there. And, a lot of the families that live there have, parties for the adults. So you kind of hang out with your friends and your kids trick or treat. It's just really nice. So yeah, as you would expect, there's a lot of upsides to living out in the country. That my wife and I and the kids, really never took for granted. All right, now to the downsides, and there are some pretty significant downsides. One is you're surrounded by nature. That's a double-edged sword. There's really nice things about it, but there's also some kind of negative things about it. When your kids are young, or you have, small animals, The fact that there's like bears like in the woods, you see coyotes, there's these nasty, they're called fisher cats. They're like these really aggressive weasels, and they kill, small animals. They eat them. The rumor is that the town actually brought them in years ago because there were so many squirrels, and I guess fisher cats eat squirrels. But then the fisher cat population kind of expanded, and it got kind of scary. I don't see them around as much anymore. So definitely there's, the wildlife component has its downside. The other thing is, because it's so wooded here, like especially this time of year, the bugs are just killer. Like, I don't mean to sound like a whiner. I know no matter what community you're in, even in New York, I'm sure there's mosquitoes and stuff. But here, it's to the extreme, especially around now. Like right now, it's sort of mid-July. The ticks this year, 2026, have been horrendous. Like I've never seen it like this. When I take Teddy in, our little dog, I'm pulling like 2-3 ticks off him like every time I go outside, and they're on me. They're in the house. And the other thing is, like right now, like it's like late June, July. I think they call them June flies. They're like these vicious flies that land on you and they just start chewing, and you don't know they're on you until it's kind of too late, and you get these huge welts. So yeah, so the nature thing is definitely a downside. The deer, they're beautiful, but they eat all my plants. The very expensive bushes, they just ravage them. So in the fall, I got to wrap them with this netting. It takes like forever. So yes, I do have some issues with some of the wildlife. The other one that's kind of a double-edged sword is that, yes, we're really close. Everybody's close. The families are very tight. But everybody knows everybody's business, like to the extreme. Kids blab. And, we live in an era where parents tell their kids everything. So it goes from parent to kid, to their friend kid, to the other parents. So everybody knows everything, like intimate details. And I think some people are naive and think like they know everything about everybody, but the other families don't know about them. That's naive. I know there's no secrets. So sort of the lack of privacy is a little bit disconcerting sometimes. The other thing is, no question, when you live way out in the country, you miss out on just some of the conveniences of living near a city. When just having access to like the museums and great restaurants, shows, there's some excellent restaurants around here, but there's maybe like 3 in a 20-mile radius. In fact, when my wife and I decided to move out to Harvard, we vowed if we're going to do this, we're going to take our kids into Boston like at least once a month, so that they don't become like country bumpkins, like unsophisticated country bumpkins. And you know how that goes. The kids come. We're lucky if we go into Boston, especially when the kids were living home, maybe twice a year. So again, and also just access to really good doctors. Like when I lived in and around Boston, you have access to the best specialists there are. Mass General. Like when I was in an accident, I got hit by a motorcycle. They took me to Mass General. I had like 5 surgeries. Then I recovered at Spalding Rehab, like one of the best hospitals, best, recovery centers in the world. And it was because I live right there. And it's not to say that there aren't, some great doctors out here, but as far as like the specialists, I kind of miss that, being near Boston. Also, like, again, I hate to sound like a whiner, but, it was nice when I used to just be able to put the garbage out in front of the house. Now, our driveway is like, it's almost a quarter-mile long. So I have to drag these barrels, down the driveway every Thursday morning, and it's just a pain in the neck. And this is the sort of as far as the convenience goes, this is a biggie. And this one I just wasn't anticipating. The fact that we don't have town sewers, we have septic, that in and of itself isn't the problem. It's that because of that, you can't have a garbage disposal. And again, I know I sound like a big, whiny, spoiled brat baby, but like not having a garbage disposal has a lot bigger impact than I would have expected. It's like you can't, like, it's just every time we get off the dinner table, lunch, whatever, you have to wipe the dishes off. You can't put anything down the sink, or you're going to clog the sink and you're going to have to call the plumber. So I guess I took it for granted when I was, every place I lived up until now, I always had a garbage disposal. Really nice. So I guess the last downside, and this is the one I wasn't expecting. I wouldn't even have thought of this, that this would be a downside, is that, if you're out in a community in the country that's very, very small, small school, you're not part of a regional school, you're probably not going to have, the kids aren't going to have a football team. Now, I've mentioned this in a prior video. Like, I did not allow my son to play football, even at recess or, when he was with his friends. But, when I was growing up, my high school had, a football team. And just those Friday nights or, the Saturday afternoon football games, they were huge. They were so fun. Like, those were some of the best memories I had, especially in high school. Or we always had a game Thanksgiving morning. There was a game the kids all went. So that one actually, I kind of wish my kids had access to that, because that was just something I remember very fondly. So anyway, here's the point, and I'm going to overstate the obvious. Whether you decide to raise your kids in a city, in the suburbs, or out in the country, there's advantages and disadvantages. For a city, they have amazing things, in terms of culture, sports, sport events, entertainment. There's upsides and downsides to every environment, but you got to decide like what your priorities are, what's important to you. You just go through the checklist. For us, we didn't have to do any sort of big analysis. It was more of a gut thing. Like, my wife and I just always wanted to raise our kids, in an area where it was kind of peaceful, a lot of space, kind of a little more laid back. So for us, the decision was kind of easy. Anyway, that's it for today. Please do subscribe. I'd love to have you be part of the community, and drop me a comment. Tell me what you think of this format. I'm interested in knowing. So we'll see you next time.